All right, guys, so let's talk about this story. I got multiple different angles on this story for you here. So Mediaite says, FBI detains Ohio man over plot to smuggle ISIS operatives over Mexico border to assassinate George W. Bush. Let's see what they say about it. There's a lot going on in that headline. Let's see what they say about it. Then I'm going to give you an interesting piece that is skeptical to say the least.
And we have breaking news on an alleged plot by an ISIS operative here in the U.S. to assassinate former President George W. Bush. It's part of an ongoing and long-running investigation. There is no threat to the former president, I understand. Joining me now, NBC News Justice correspondent.
There's no threat to the former president. So the whole point is there's a threat to the former president, and then they're like, well, there's really no threat. I guess they're saying they neutralized the threat, but that's still curious that they had to lead with that.
Pete Williams and Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI assistant director and MSNBC national security analyst. Pete, Forbes first reported on this. What do we know?
Well, Andrea, it's quite clear now from reading the court documents in this case that there never really was any threat to the president. This is certainly a person who wanted.
There never really was any threat to the president. But isn't the whole point that you're saying there is a threat to the president? Isn't that the whole point of the story? But no, there was never any real threat to the president. So what exactly are we talking about?
To try to do harm to the president, but never had the capability to do anything. And it's quite clear that the FBI initially got interested in him because he was trying to smuggle people into the U.S. for money. There's no suggestion when the FBI began to pay attention to him that he was trying to smuggle terrorists in here. He just wanted to smuggle in people who were not otherwise legally able to enter the country from Iraq to make money. His name is Shihab Ahmed Shihab, and according to court
I'm not even going to say anything.
Documents, he is from Iraq. He entered the U.S. in September 20, and there's some indication that he himself committed visa fraud when he entered the country. But that's when the FBI began to have two undercover operatives talk to him, constantly record conversations with him when he discussed his idea about bringing people in here to make money. And then, as the conversations went along, at one point, he begins to talk about his connections to ISIS. He says that he drove trucks and vehicles around Iraq that had explosives in them that were used to attack Americans. Whether that's true or not, there's no suggestion in the court documents. That's his claim. And then as the months went by, he said he wanted to bring in 4 or 5 or maybe 6 Iraqis who would be willing to join him in a plot to assassinate the former president. At one point in February of last year, one of the undercover operatives picked up a Shihab down at the airport, and they went and actually drove past the Bush compound. And according to court documents, Shihab made a video of that with his cell phone. But the court documents say Shihab never actually sent the video anywhere because he was afraid that it would be intercepted by law enforcement. And that's pretty much it, Andrea. So there's no suggestion that any of the people he wanted to get here to do this were ever smuggled into the U.S. No suggestion that he had any firearms or capability to do this on his own. It's just an idea that he had in his head, but he never did any much with it. Nonetheless, he has been arrested. He is in custody. He'll be appearing in court this afternoon where he lives in Columbus, Ohio, and he'll face these charges.
Okay, to say that story is weird is a massive understatement. So, let's go to this article from Adam H. Johnson of the Citations Needed podcast and of this Substack here. ISIS Bush assassination story has all the markers of an overhyped FBI manufactured narrative. 20 years on, and dozens of examples of dubious entrapment schemes later, why does our media still mindlessly repeat FBI claims of foiled terror plots? Okay, so let me just reflect on that point for a second. What he's saying is unquestionably accurate. There have been a number of examples of effectively entrapment schemes that are made up where the FBI foils a terror plot and then they use that, as an argument to get more funding. And we've seen it throughout, the War on Terror era, even with the whole like Gretchen Whitmer, kidnapping plot. Turns out that was not really true. So let's see what his argument is here. As I've written about, and of course, hold on 1 second, real quick. The fact that the media always just repeats what the intelligence agencies say to them is a huge problem with the media. You guys are supposed to be fact checkers. You guys are supposed to give information. Just because somebody in an intelligence agency says something doesn't make it true, but they just assume it's true by definition. It's like state media. It's what it is. They're just doing propaganda. As I've written about for over 7 years, there is no wider gap in reality versus headlines in U.S. media than the light years chasm between splashy headlines involving thwarted terror attacks and the actual details of the case. Well over 20 years into our war on terror, so-called terror plots thwarted by the FBI, with rare exception, are pushed along by, funded by, and materially supported by the FBI, which more often than not is simply stepping in at the 11th hour to stop Potemkin plots of its own making. Important qualifier here so there's no confusion. Very often with these terror plot cases, whether they be ISIS or domestic terror, the person at the core of the plot very much has dangerous ideological beliefs, and their interaction with law enforcement is often preceded by threats or extremist online chatter. The degree of responsibility exists in a spectrum. Sometimes they are mentally unwell dupes who would have otherwise posed no real threat, and the plot is almost entirely of the FBI's creation. Sometimes they play a more central role, and while the plot may not have happened without FBI assistance, it very well may have. It's difficult to know at first blush, and without access to the actual affidavit or response from the accused legal counsel, where the latest foiled FBI plot falls on the spectrum. But given history and the details we do know, our media, as a rule, ought to be much more skeptical before announcing scary FBI-curated headlines about dastardly plots. All right, so let me respond to that, because I think he made a number of good points there. Look, if there's somebody who is genuinely mentally unwell, and they're on the verge of doing violent actions, and, the FBI sets up a situation where they are then facilitated to do that violent action, and they are in the process of being about to do it, I actually understand why somebody like that, you do kind of want to charge them with a crime and get them off the streets, because they are a danger. They're a danger to everybody. So there are instances of, like the so-called entrapment schemes around, for example, sex crimes, or not sex crimes, sex work. So when you have an undercover sting operation for some prostitution thing where you're talking about consenting adults, I don't support that at all, because that's it's something that should be legal anyway. And so there's no victim in the situation. It's two consenting adults. It should be legal and safe and regulated, but it's not. And so people go underground for those sorts of needs, and then they might end up getting locked up as a result of it. I don't support that at all. Drug stings, same thing. Drugs should be legal, taxed, and regulated. You shouldn't be locking people up for these nonviolent crimes. They're not really crimes. So there's certain sting operations or entrapment schemes that I think are stupid and go way too far and are a waste of resources, a waste of time. But when it comes to actual violent criminals, there are instances where I could support in a sting operation to get somebody who would have otherwise committed a violent crime. But to Adam Johnson's point, there's a number of instances in modern American history where these are not people who would have committed a crime, and then they get locked up. It was driven totally by the FBI, and then they locked the person up anyway when they're the ones who plotted everything along the way. So, and look, that's the history of it. If you have an issue with it, I don't know what to tell you, because that's what actually happens. But he's saying in this case, we don't know for sure, but the fact that the intelligence agencies haven't really presented any evidence should make you skeptical of the claims. The media shouldn't just mindlessly report it without any ounce of skepticism. Earlier today, Forbes broke a story about the FBI stepping in to break up an assassination plot by Iraqi national Ahmed Shihab to take out former President George W. Bush, supposedly as revenge for the Iraq War. Scanning the scary headlines, the average media consumer would come away thinking there was a real material ISIS plot to kill Bush that was foiled at the last minute by the heroic FBI agents. And then here are the headlines. Further inspection of the details, however, revealed that the plot, like most ISIS Al-Qaeda plots, the FBI Thwarts was likely moved along by and facilitated by FBI agents and well-paid FBI informants. Forbes doesn't say how much these informants were paid, but in some previous thwarted plots, it has been as high as 6 figures. The only actionable thing the suspect did, other than supposedly try to recruit people in WhatsApp was surveil George Bush's Dallas residence. An FBI informant paid for the flight, picked up Shihab, and ushered him to the residence, according to NBC News. After traveling to Dallas with the informant to take video of Bush's residence, Forbes writes, the accused took more footage at the George W. Bush Institute. Buried under the typical sensationalist headlines and FBI press release, NBC's Pete Williams broke the fourth wall a bit and noted the suspect never had any means to carry out the plot, never had any weapons himself. There's no indication that any of the people he was trying to smuggle into the U.S. ever got here. This is consistent with years of war on terror foiled plots. According to one 2013 study by researcher Trevor Aronson, less than 1% of terror plots foiled by the FBI are real plots, in the sense that they would have occurred whether the FBI was monitoring them or not. That's astonishing. Now, even if that number's massively off, let's say that 1% number's massively off, what, 5% of the plots would have been real plots without the FBI involvement? So the FBI does the plot, and then they turn around and declare themselves heroes for preventing the plot. I mean, where was I? It's also possible, though not mentioned in the uncritical Forbes report, the actual warrant has not been made available by the FBI, that the ID itself was that of the FBI's. This is not unusual. In a high-profile thwarted terror plots like Rochester New Year's Eve attack or the Newburgh 4, the sexy headline-grabbing premise of the attack was cooked up by the FBI itself or one of its informants. Now, the person under surveillance goes along with it, but the actual materialization of idle ranting or social media posts into actionable plot is pushed along by the FBI itself. For the most suspect of all these plots, we have to look no further than the Dallas metropolitan area. Recall the 2015 Draw Muhammad cartoon contest attack in Garland, Texas. The plot was pushed along by FBI agents. Not even informants, but actual undercover FBI agents. But instead of being stopped at the 11th hour, the plot actually happened, resulting in a security guard being shot and injured. Indeed, the night before the attack, one of the undercover FBI agents told the suspect, Elton Simpson, to tear up Texas. Jesus. So now this is an instance of they push it along and actually make it happen, and weren't able to intervene to stop it. It's unbelievable. An FBI agent, as 60 Minutes reported 2 years later, was actually present at the time of the FBI attack. One even stood a few feet from the suspect as shots were fired. Jesus Christ. At the time, the public was, of course, given none of this information. No skeptical reporting about potential FBI involvement, just mindless stenography about the lurking dangers of ISIS. So anyway, this goes on, everybody. Oh, actually, it's just 2 paragraphs. We'll finish it here. Indeed, now discredited former New York Times ISIS expert reporter Rukmini Callimachi worked overtime to link Simpson to actual ISIS recruiters overseas, with her piece Clues on Twitter show ties between Texas gunmen and ISIS network. She raised no questions about FBI links to the suspect. Given the dicey history of these FBI 11th hour plots, especially such high-profile botched plots in the Dallas area, perhaps an ounce of skepticism or context is long overdue from our national security reporters when it comes to simply repeating FBI claims at face value. It's very possible the FBI stopped a real, material, well-connected ISIS plot to kill Bush, but given what we know about the essential role informants played in this plot and the long 2-decade history of these sensationalist headlines falling apart under close scrutiny, perhaps a bit of sobriety, skepticism, and nuance is in order. I totally agree with that. The final point is this. The FBI spied on Malcolm X, spied on MLK, and tried to get MLK to kill himself. They viewed him as an enemy. Now, you could say, well, the FBI over the years has changed and now they're on the up and up. I don't believe that. And so the same agency that tried to get a civil rights hero and icon to kill himself is now the agency that's being taken at face value by our media. Now, again, to Adam's point, maybe it's true. Maybe this is an instance where it was a real terror plot and it was really stopped by them. Maybe. But maybe not, given their history. And so, yes, at the very least, skepticism, nuance, maybe a talk about the history on both sides of it. Hey, here's an actual terror plot that was stopped, and here's 3 of them where they kind of pushed it along. And it wouldn't have happened without their input. So, there you have it. The second I saw that headline, and then I read articles on it, and I watched that clip from CNN, I was like, it's just weird how throughout the whole thing they keep saying, like, he really had no intention of doing it. Like, they're admitting it, but then they're also saying, well, he foiled a terror plot, and they foiled a terror plot and stopped the assassination of Bush. It's like, both those things can't be true. There's a massive contradiction there. If you want to see me and Crystal Ball interview legends like Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, and more, subscribe to Crystal, Kyle, and Friends on Substack. $5 a month gets you the video version a day early. Remember, we take 0 ad dollars for this podcast. Or you can sign up on Substack for free and get the audio version a day later. Link in the video description box below.